This video is all about Fuji's announcement of the X-H2, a video powerhouse that's capable of delivering 8K video at all the basic frame rates for less than half that of the competition and include Apple ProRes. Details coming up, but first I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so you're kept informed on the latest camera gear, news, and rumors. In 2020, when the first rumors came out of the Canon EOS R5, I was impressed. I couldn't believe it. This camera seemed too good to be true. 8K RAW at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second, 8K oversample 4K, and 4K up to 120 frames per second. It had IBIS, Canon log, and it did all this without any cropped modes and with phase detect autofocus working for a price of $3,900. And I was impressed with the camera so much, I ended up buying it, and it's what I use for this channel. But it costs $38.99. And then in October last year, Nikon released the Nikon Z9, capable of 8K up to 60 frames per second, and it introduced Apple ProRes, although that capped out at 4K. And now today, we have Fuji announcing the Fuji X-H2 for $1,999, almost half the price of the R5, less than half the price of the Nikon Z9, and it can do 8K video. And if you're interested in pre-ordering this camera, you can pre-order it right now, and I do have a link to B&H's pre-order for the Fujifilm X-H2. But I want to take you back now to yesterday when I did the leak specifications for the Fujifilm X-H2. One of the things I said was, these leaks sound pretty good, these specifications sound pretty good, but it's also, well, it's the devil in the details that always matters. And the reason I'm doing the video now is I've gotten a lot more information. We've seen some first-hand reviews of this camera. And, well, let's first of all start off with the specifications. The rumors were correct by and large. This camera does have a 40 megapixel sensor. It's an APS-C sensor, and it's backside illuminated, so that's good news there. And in terms of high-speed continuous shooting, it can shoot 15 frames mechanical and up to 20 frames per second electronic. However, and here's one of the caveats that we didn't see in those full specifications from yesterday, 20 frames per second electronic is with a 1.29 times crop. Now, the autofocus system is greatly improved in this camera over previous models, but really not that much of a difference over the X-H2S. Now, the X-H2S was all about speed, so you might see some subtle differences between these two cameras when it comes to the autofocus system. The camera also comes with IBIS. It's a 5-axis IBIS system capable of 7 stops, and it utilizes pixel shift technology, able to give you a really high-res image of 160 megapixels. But now let's move on to the video specifications. There's an awful lot to cover off here. First of all, let's talk about 8K. It does not do DCI. So in 8K, it only does UHD, and it does it at 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. So all your basic frame rates. It also does 6.2K, again, in all the basic frame rates of 24, 25, and 30. But now in 4K, we have many options. We have 4K all the way up to 60 frames per second. So the basic frame rates of 24, 25, and 30. And what's significant about those basic frame rates is we get 8K oversample 4K, providing an awful lot of detail. And my friend Gordon Lang has already reviewed the camera, and he's already got footage showing you 8K oversample 4K and all the other video modes as well. The camera also does Full HD or 1080. It does all the basic frame rates of 24, 25, and 30 frames per second, 50 and 60 frames per second, 100 and 120 frames per second. But wait, there's more. It can also do up to 240 or 200 frames per second. Now, there is a bit of a downside here. It does do that with a bit of a crop, but all those other video modes, as mentioned, don't include a crop. And now let's get back to 8K video. As I mentioned earlier, the camera can do 8K in 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. Now, if you're going to be recording externally, well, the camera is able to deliver Apple ProRes RAW along with that, or Blackmagic RAW. Now, if you don't have an external recorder and you're recording internally, you don't get RAW, but you get Apple ProRes HQ, and yes, you get that in 8K. Apple ProRes RAW in 8K. The Nikon Z9, a camera that costs $5,900, doesn't do Apple ProRes in 8K in any version, whether it's LT, HQ, 422, 444, RAW. It doesn't do Apple ProRes in 8K. So here we have a camera that costs less than half price, $19.99, and it can do Apple ProRes HQ internally or RAW externally. That's pretty impressive. And of course, the Canon EOS R5, well, it doesn't do Apple ProRes at all, although it does do RAW, and that is one of the advantages that the Canon EOS R5 has over the Fujifilm X-H2. I bought the Canon EOS R5 just over 2 years ago, and I've been using it almost every day. And the one mode that I shoot almost every time without fail, my default, and it's what I'm shooting with right now, and that's 4K HQ, which is the 8K oversampled 4K, because, well, I just absolutely love the detail. It's amazing the level of detail that you can see with this camera, and if you don't own it, you can't truly appreciate it. Everything that I put out on this channel, whether it's 8K oversampled 4K, 8K videos themselves, the level of quality that you see versus what I see on my screen before I export, it's like a whole new world. The detail that I see is so much greater. If you have a Nikon Z9, you understand. If you have a Canon EOS R5, you understand. And of course now, if you have a Fujifilm X-H2, you understand as well. To have the most detailed 4K video, 8K oversampled 4K for $1,999. Now the Sony a7S III doesn't do 8K, but its 4K is very detailed. It's very close to 8K oversampled 4K on the Canon EOS R5. But that camera costs around, what, $35.99, around $3,600? This camera, the X-H2, is $1,999. And while $2,000 isn't cheap for a camera here in Canada, it's going to cost us around $3,000, isn't it, Mark? Yeah, $3,000 Canadian, or $2,000. But when you look at some of the video specifications that you can do 4K up to 60 frames per second, 1080 up to 240 frames per second, and you can shoot 8K all the way up to 30 frames per second, and you can do 8K oversample 4K, 6.2K. It's a pretty powerful camera, and we're not getting left in the lurch. We still have F-Log and F-Log 2. Or is it F-Log 2? Yes. I'm getting confused with Canon, where we have Canon Log 1 and Canon Log 3, but no Canon Log 2. So it's F-Log 1 and F-Log 2. Oh, and one other thing. Now, this doesn't apply to Nikon Z9 customers, but it does to a lot of Canon customers. The Fujifilm X-H2 doesn't have a recording limit. No recording limit. Now, it's really going to be based on your battery life, and your battery life is going to be based on the temperature. But if you've got some sort of external power supply, or if you're going to be powering it from the mains, well, you can record indefinitely. At this point, I've heard nothing about any overheats, no overheat limits. 8K up to 30 frames per second, 8K oversample 4K, no overheat, no record limit. That's pretty powerful. So there must be something wrong with this camera, right? Well, that really depends. Now, rolling shutter does matter, and it depends on the camera, and it depends on the degree of rolling shutter. When I tested the Canon EOS R5, 8K, 4K, 1080, it had a rolling shutter, but it wasn't the level of rolling shutter that would make you nauseous, where the whole world was wibbly wobbly, like having like 3 beers really quickly. However, the Fujifilm X-H2, the rolling shutter is a little bit pronounced in 4K. In 8K, it's quite pronounced. It's not enough. It's not as bad as the Canon EOS R was, but it's enough that if you're going to be doing certain scenarios, like you're going to be doing high-speed sports, or your subject's moving, whether your camera's panning at a fast speed or whether your subject's moving at a fast speed, you're going to notice that rolling shutter. So it depends on what you're shooting. However, I do want to say this. While a global shutter would prevent any sort of rolling shutter, it's not essential. Look at any action movie in Hollywood, and what you're going to see is some degree of rolling shutter if the subject is moving very fast or if the camera's panning very fast. But it's not significant enough that it really distracts the user. In fact, most people don't even realize it. It's only people like me that when they watch these movies and TV shows, because of what I do, because I'm in the industry in a very amateurish way, I see these things. I recognize them. I recognize color grading artifacts. I recognize color grading techniques. I recognize rolling shutter. So the rolling shutter is a little bit pronounced. If you actually want to see what the rolling shutter is like, I want to do a bit of a shout out to 2 of my friends. Gordon Lang has already published a video on the Fujifilm X-H2S and the X-H2, and he shows you, he's got hands-on in New York, and he's showing you the degree of rolling shutter that these cameras produce. And of course, Jordan Drake of DP Review with his friend Chris, well, he also does a review of these cameras as well, and I like his sense of humor. He's a fellow Canadian. He lives in the cold climate, and well, if you're going to live that far north in the cold, you'd better have a sense of humor. I know I certainly do. I'm not as far north as they are, and I don't get those really, really cold Alberta winters. So yes, there is definitely a rolling shutter. It's not really, really bad, but it is more pronounced in 8K. So if we were to look at both of these two cameras side by side, not the R5, but the XH2S and the XH2, we're going to find that they look, well, identical with the exception of that S on one of the cameras. The ports, the button, the general camera design, the die, everything, they're pretty much the same. So you might be wondering, well, what is the real difference between these two cameras? What is Fuji's strategy? Well, it's actually quite simple. We've got the Fujifilm XH2S, and I like to look at that S as standing for speed. That camera is all about speed. 40 frames per second. It's all about moving data very, very fast from when it first punches through that lens directly onto the sensor, moving it off the sensor through the image processor and to the storage. It's all about speed, and both of these cameras have a UHS 2 card slot as well as a CF Express Type B card slot. But the XH2S is purely about speed, and that's what it's built for. However, the Fujifilm XH2 has a slightly different design. It's not about speed, but it's about detail. And sometimes these go hand in hand, but you have to spend a lot more. And that's where we're seeing a difference between a camera like the Canon EOS R5 that has both speed and detail, but you're having to pay twice the price. So that's one of the reasons why you're seeing this camera at $2,000 versus $3,900 for the Canon EOS R5 or $5,500 for the Nikon Z9. The XH2 is all about detail. We can see that in the video. 8K video, 24, 25, and 30 frames per second. Apple ProRes, RAW, and HQ, they're video editing codecs. And then we get the detail in the video through 8K over sample 4K, or you can shoot with 6.2K and downsample yourself in post. There's so many options. And in stills, it's also about detail. And while it has a 40 megapixel sensor, you're not going to be shooting nearly as fast. You're looking at 15 frames per second mechanical. And if you don't want to have to deal with a cropped sensor or a cropped image, then you're going to stay away from electronic, which I think has a 1.29 times crop. But to really sum up, what we have here in the Fujifilm, the XH2, is a camera that takes a lot of what we see in the Canon EOS R5 or the Nikon Z9 when it comes to video. We see a very high detailed video, 8K over sample 4K, and there's really only a couple of cameras out there that can do that. The R5, and of course the Nikon Z9. And I should really give a special nod to the Sony a7S III. While it doesn't do 8K over sample 4K, its 4K is almost as detailed as 8K over sample 4K. So we've really got three cameras that can give us this level of detail for $2,000. So what you're getting is a camera that can do really, really detailed 4K video or 8K video for a fraction of the price of the competition. However, the autofocus still needs a little bit of work. The autofocus isn't quite up there with the market leaders of Sony and Canon. But as I discovered today, when I was shooting my sons back to school, and yes, it was yesterday, but it was cloudy and the weather wasn't so good and I was feeling cranky, so through the miracle of video, I made it today. And I had a wide shot of him coming out through the door, and it was perfect. It looked great, but when I got back into post, even though I shot the scene twice, the first time he was clumsy and it didn't work out, but the second time, the focus is perfect. And as soon as the door opens, it hunts. At this point, it can't see his face, but instead of just staying locked onto the door until it could pull out a face, it hunted a bit, and then when he came out, it locked onto his face. But that lost that clip. It no longer worked for me. And even on a good autofocus system that Sony and Canon have, it still needs to be improved, and Fuji needs to continue improving their autofocus system. The Fujifilm XH2S, the autofocus system is greatly improved, but it still has some issues. And again, I direct your attention to Jordan Drake and Chris Nichols, as well as Gordon Lang. They've both done really good in-depth videos looking at the autofocus system. Now, the autofocus system on the XH2 is pretty much the same, but again, it's got different processors and sensors, so it might not be 100% the same. So there is a bit of a drawback there, and of course, the rolling shutter. But again, I can't help but look at the value that this camera provides. And some people said to me, are you kidding me? A $2,000 APS-C camera for the same price as a good full frame camera? Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. You're getting a $2,000 camera that can do 8K. And this is where, if we look at individual specifications, we are missing the point. It's about outcomes. To be able to get really detailed video in 4K or 8K, or to even get 8K video, it's a very small club. And until Fuji came out with the XH2, you were going to have to spend at least $3,600 pre-tax and shipping for a Sony, or $3,900 for the Canon EOS R5 with 8K over sample 4K, or $5,500 for the Nikon Z9. I think Fuji has done a really good job here. Sure, they need to work on their autofocus system, and sure, the rolling shutter can be a little bit dizzy-like in 8K, but I think there's an awful lot of value here. There's an awful lot of power. But one word of caution, if you are looking at buying this camera, and yes, not just look at my links down below to use the pre-order through B&H, but don't cheap out on glass. To really take advantage of the detail, you need to invest in good glass, because if you get low-grade glass, you're not going to see that detail. That detail isn't going to translate. You're going to see aberration in the edges. You're going to see loss of sharpness. And what's the point of capturing detail through the camera, spending all the money on the camera, and then having a lens that doesn't allow you to capture that detail? So do make sure you get a decent glass, maybe get the body, and then use whatever lens that is going to give you the look that you're looking for. But yeah, no, I'm pretty impressed with this camera. When I first saw the details earlier today, I thought, you know what, I'm not ready to do a video on this yet. I know Gordon's come out with this video. I know many others have come out with their video. And I wanted to take a look at the details. I really wanted to understand what this camera was all about. 40 frames per second in the XH2S versus 15 frames mechanical here, 8K video. Yeah, but what is it like? I've seen cameras advertise 48 megapixels or 45 megapixels in smartphones many years ago that produced terrible results. And I'm glad I took the time out. So yes, I'm not going to get nearly as many views as other channels getting their content out there sooner. But having spent time to look at what's out there and to compare it to how I felt when I got the R5 and what it's like to shoot with an 8K camera, I'm blown away. I'm pretty impressed here. $2,000. This is another camera that if it had been available in 2019 or even 2020, I might have bought it over the Canon EOS R5 because it's half the price of the Canon EOS R5. To get that level of detail in 4K and to be able to have 8K, for those of you who still think 8K isn't important, it really is. The same people, quite often I find that say 8K isn't important, will crop into their photos. And if you're a photographer, I can understand your view of thinking, who needs 8K? But for us videographers, that 8K allows us to crop in later. Just like photographers can crop in their stills, we can crop in video. Because most of the times I'm shooting in 8K, I'm not publishing in 8K. Very few videos do actually publish in 8K. I've done a handful of them, well, maybe 6. So a handful and a little bit more. But 8K is powerful. And one thing else about 8K, it's going to be far more common. Right, Mark? 8K is no longer something that is used by a very few. 4K has become the standard in most sectors, and now 8K is often being used. Oh, and one last thing. If you want to stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors, or if you really like this video, go ahead and subscribe because I've got a lot more coming. But make sure you hit that all notifications button, because if you don't, you're not going to get notified of my latest videos. And by choosing all notifications, as soon as I publish a video, YouTube's going to send you a notification to that notification bell at the top so you can stay up to date on the latest camera news and rumors. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourself a great weekend. Oh, it's not Friday. Well, it's Friday for you when you're watching this, but for me, it's still Thursday night. But anyhow, have yourself a good weekend, and we'll see you again soon.